All right, it says going live now. I'm going to. All right, it says going live now. Uh-oh. I'm going to. Uh-oh.
Magical. It's
All right.
now a pointless feature. It's not a
All right, that should be a little bit better. I see that we have a few people in the chat. Let me know who's here. Hello. This is going to be a very short stream, I suppose. Only about a half hour. I'm only planning to go to 4 o'clock CST. We've moved up to gigabit speed, had a technician come out earlier today, fix up the issues with my transfer, and it sounds like the audio's considerably better than it usually is, but I'm gonna make sure. At least it will be better if I can avoid burping 2 seconds. I don't know when I swallowed all this air, but apparently I. Is that out? And then I'm gonna share this with a server 2. But is there a share link to Yes, there is. Okay. Let me check my audio input capture again just to make sure. Yep, mic in is Elgato Wave 3. And just running through my last audio checks here. Wonder if I might have dirty. Might be here. He might make an appearance, that is. Okay, so a little bit of the audio cuts out if I'm turned away from my camera, which I'm gonna avoid, or not my camera, away from my microphone, which I'm gonna avoid from here out on out. Here on out, what I meant to say. And I'll just keep my laptop for managing comments nearby. My new desk is not arriving until tomorrow, so that will be annoying. When I upload this as a individual video or on the, it'll be available on the Streambots playtest. But I suppose when I upload this as an individual video, I'll just cut out the center here. Really see any point to keeping it around. One of the things I hate is live streams that don't have any editing to them. This looks completely pointless. All right. So the only window capture up is for Chromebook. Not Chromebook. I have a Chromebook next to me, but Google Chrome. No, I don't use Chrome anymore. It's Firefox. Check through here.
to be more accurate, it was changed. Now, instead of the weapon becoming
Test some of the audio here for the desktop audio.
Whether you do your regular damage type or you do radiant. The Circle of the Moon subclass for Druid has a wild shape feature that gets 6th level called Primal Strike in 5th edition. And the benefit of this feature is that your attacks in beast form count as magical. This feature was removed in the most recent playtest. Or to be more accurate, it was changed. Now,
Boosting
instead of
up
your
a
attacks
little
being
bit
treated as
further.
magical, you can change your damage type to acid, cold, fire, lightning, or thunder damage if you want to. You choose when you make the attack, whether you do your regular damage type or the elemental damage type. So in my videos discussing these changes, I speculated.
Yeah,
I
that
said
seems
maybe
about
the
a
D&D
good
design team
ratio
was
here.
planning to get rid of resistances to non-magical damage. And I also said, if that was the case, then great. And I was asked in the comments, as well as in other channels, why I thought it was great. Well, I've already gone over why I think these resistances are bad for the game, but I also mentioned problems with just getting rid of
Alrighty, so I'm going to swap that out. We're going to get started here. Hi, I figured that I'd test out the stream audio by addressing a video I saw here. Hey, Six of Swords. Hey, listen, if the audio sounds good, I'm happy about that. So, I figured I'd do a quick live stream just to test out my internet speed, see if everything was working properly. It looks like I'm meeting the 6,000 kilobits a second, kilobits second for streaming quality, and it looks like the audio is at 320, which is exactly where I want it. It looks like it's matching 320 at the very least. Hey, Durian is here. See, I figured you'd be here. Always following me, my loyal squire. So, I couldn't think of a topic until this morning when somebody sent a video of Treantmonks. A Treantmonk, you guys might know him from a lot of just various guides. I think he's mostly known from his Giant in the Playground forum guides. I found him on a Orc Labs podcast back when I was working as a groundskeeper and was in desperate need of. It was right when I first started playing D&D, and I'd been a groundskeeper for many years, and of course, everything I did was just suck down podcasts because I'm out on 10,000 acres with nobody nearby and nobody to talk to, and just needed some kind of stimulation. Otherwise, I was probably going to shove the active weed whacker into my neck. I didn't do that. Found found the Orc Labs podcast. Those guys shut down ages ago, but they had one of their last episodes was an interview with Treantmonk, and that was my introduction to him. I found the God Wizard guide. Has begun creeping back into my vocabulary. I found the God Wizard 5th edition guide for that particular playstyle. Didn't find it overly helpful, especially given that 5th edition wasn't really his fault. 5th edition was pretty set on on tamping down on that specific character fantasy in pretty much every way that it could. So it's not like he was bad at doing his job. He was very good at presenting his arguments for things in a pretty concise and coherent fashion. It was relatively trustworthy for folks who had any familiarity with him. I'm aware, of course, that he has a YouTube channel now. I have not watched it. I have not watched any of his videos, but I was in Aaron the Pedantic's Discord server this morning, and this video was linked.
Chris here. The party
About 1D&D. Let's see here. We have a nice clickbait title, which I respect. That's totally fine. Is 1D&D getting rid of this terrible rule in D&D 5e? And the rule in question is... How do I phrase this, even? Resistance or immunity to non-magical attacks from player weapons, or from, you could just say, character weapons, from weapon damage. Immunity to non-magical weapon damage, or resistance to non-magical weapon damage, piercing, bludgeoning, and slashing specifically, because usually the elements are not included in this. In fact, I've almost never seen the elements included in this. So, now obligated to debunk this particular video because I think it is a useful mechanic. I disagree, broadly speaking, with most of Treantmonk's arguments for or against it, and we're going to go through the video together, and I'm more or less going to review it. And probably this is pretty much the start of the stream, folks. Hello. We're going to go over Treantmonk's video on why he thinks bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage should pretty much always, or should not, be restricted on a basis of magical or non-magical, or why he thinks a specific rule is bad. And I'm going to offer my arguments against it. My personal arguments for it, which are different from Treantmonk's, and why I think his argumentation is, broadly speaking, bad. I think it falls under a category of players that Gygax mentioned as earliest records of the hobby that we have, Gygax mentioning players who will constantly basically argue in their own favor for rules that end up diminishing or damaging the campaign. So we're going to go through it. I'm going to test out. We're going to try out 1.25 speed, and then if that's too slow or whatever, maybe we'll bump it up to 1.5. We'll see.
Cautiously
Here
exploring
it
the cavern
is.
system. The goblin bandits were tracked to these caves. The hideout must be here somewhere. Rounding a corner, the DM announces a group perception check. The light spell from your staff reveals something moving slightly within a large crack in the eastern wall. It slithers closer, and you see a greenish worm-like monstrosity. Its barbed tentacles unfurl, revealing a hungry, snapping beak. Combat begins, and the warlock fires their Eldritch Blast, hitting and wounding the horrible creature. The wizard fires a Ray of Frost, injuring it further and slowing its movement. The barbarian rages and closes with the deadly foe and attacks recklessly with their great axe and scores a hit.
I'm just going to interrupt this here. I think that this is making me reconsider whether I should include the little story snippets at the beginning of my videos. I don't know. Now watching this, I don't know how entertaining that is. That is a cheap shot. I mean, no offense, Treantmonk. But I don't know. It has me reevaluating how I'm going to do some of my content in the future.
DM then volunteers. Your great axe isn't magical, so you notice it doesn't seem to be hurt as much as you would expect by your blow. What? The Grick is one of many, many monsters in 5th edition D&D that seemingly, randomly, has resistance to non-magical bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage. There is nothing in the grip description or appearance explaining why this particular resistance exists, or...
Alright, so we're going to pause there for a second and explain. As you can see, I have already done on screen. I am not impressed with this line of reasoning, but it is something I can sympathize with. Many of the creatures in 5th edition have sort of been designed in a fashion that makes it very clear many of them were left behind, more or less, in the design. So when an update came to the monsters in 5th edition, an update came to the, let's say we're in year 2, or, sorry, well, they don't do design like that. Let's say we're in month 2 of designing the 5th edition monster manual, and a decision has been made that all of the monsters need to have their damage updated. They need extra dice, they can't have comparable weapon damage because PCs inflate their hit points much faster than the monsters do, so we're gonna say, alright, well, we need to give a bunch of these guys extra damage. So it needs to be like 3d6 minimum, or 3d8 minimum, or something like that, for everything above a, let's say, CR2. It can't just be comparable to PC damage. What you find is that it looks like a lot of the monsters basically did not get updated with any particular design directives that might have been handed down. This is, of course, on a good faith, or not necessarily good faith, a charitable interpretation of the 5th edition design process, in which subjects like design were even discussed, and then directives were generated from said meetings about the ostensible design coherence of a game that was going to be 5th edition. But the spell magic weapon is concentration, says Durian. Yes, it is. We're gonna be getting to that. It is a problem, and it is one of the problems that Treantmonk brings up, and it's probably one of the fairer criticisms he has out of this video. But the point of this specific tangent is that the inclusion or exclusion of magic weapon resistance, or immunity to non-magical weapons, or resistance to non-magical weapons in the 5th edition monster manual isn't so much random as it looks just incomplete. It looks like a lot of creatures should have received this kind of treatment without having done so. Which is a little unfortunate, but that's an issue with 5th edition's monster design. When it comes to the Grick specifically, this thing is supposed to appear pretty frequently in the Underdark. The Underdark is supposed to be a default. It's one of the few examples we have in Dungeons & Dragons specifically, especially in the modern editions, where the default of a given biome or area is just supposed to be higher in difficulty, where it works a little bit more like an MMO, and you say, okay, well, you're going over to this other zone here. You know, if you're playing Valheim and you go into the Mistlands and you're not prepared for it, you're going to get wrecked. So it's completely understandable as to why you might have something like a creature that is more biome specific. And I have the Grick pulled up here. They also listed as being in the forest, but forest, Underdark for environment, yeah. I don't think it's unreasonable to have something like this have magic resistance, because among other things, it's a monstrosity. I think that's fine. Thank goodness I have a cough button here. I'm not using it for cough buttons. We have stone camouflage. We need to hide in rocky terrain. We can assume, maybe not from its appearance, but this is clearly not a magical creature. I think we're all in agreement here. Or sorry, this is not a natural creature. It's understandable as to why something like this might have a little bit of extraplanar influence. And from a game design perspective, it makes total sense that something which is unique, or not unique, something which is expected as a common enemy in a higher tier zone or a higher tier biome of play is going to have some rules elements that encourage you to not use it, or that encourage the players to not delve in to that particular zone unless they're already prepared for it. That's going to come up later. So let's continue on with the video.
Why a magical weapon ignores this resistance. It's just there. Do you like resistances to non-magical bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage? Do you hate them? Maybe you don't care. Let me know your opinions in the comments, because I'm about to give you mine. I hate them. I think they make D&D worse, and a fair bit worse. But also, it's not a mechanic that the DM can easily adjust without creating new problems. But, on the bright side, I have seen some evidence that they might be going away with 1D&D. I sure hope so. First, here's why I hate them. It creates a harsh penalty for weapon users until it doesn't. Once that barbarian finds a magic weapon, then the 60 creatures in the monster manual alone that have resistance to non-magical bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage gain no resistance to those attacks. And it is...
Alright, let's stop there. The idea that it causes a penalty until it doesn't. This is not actually a problem as far as design is concerned. If you want to gate a... So let's say... Okay, the Grick is what? What's your CR here, buddy? What do you got? Challenge rating 2. Okay, so we might as well consider it as 27 hit points. It's challenge rating 2. Does not have... There's that again. I should have a coin jar or something. It has multi-attack, which is impressive. If that attack hits... Here's again. If that attack hits, the Grick can make one beak attack against the same target, so it's kind of a conditional multi-attack. It works a little bit like Pounce. That's understandable. It's stealth, so it has a little bit of a... It's more of an ambush predator, and it has a climb speed, so everything here is making sense so far. Because it's CR2, we can assume that if the party has more of a balance of martial weapon users as opposed to casters in the party, what I would assume as a designer is that, given that's CR2, is that this is really CR3 or CR4 for lower level parties, because they don't have access to those magic weapons. Presumably they don't have access to the magic weapons yet. Presumably they don't have as many casters. The casters that they do have don't have terribly many spell slots. Unfortunately, they do have cantrips, which makes things a little bit more difficult. But those cantrips have lower to hit bonuses, they have lower saving throws available to them, so they're going to be... So the magic that they do have, even though it's at will, as far as even the weaker at-will stuff that they have is not terribly reliable, so it's not going to be a consistent diminishment of this creature's hit points. So what that means from a designer's perspective, what that says to me is, aha, this is an enemy which is intended to both be something of a potential boss or mini-boss to players of lower levels, but once they increase their level just a little bit and get a couple of magic weapons, suddenly this becomes their hit points increase, their to hit bonuses increase, their armor class increases, such that this thing becomes a dramatically lesser threat in the span of 1 to 2 levels on the part of the party. And it can now be used as a minion-style creature. That's not pointless. That's not a flaw. This is not a bug. Treantmonk, this is a feature. This is how D&D is more or less supposed to work, is you fight a thing in your first couple levels that is supposed to be threatening, and then rapidly afterwards, it becomes much less of a threat such that the people can use it as a minion. You introduce the Grick as like there's a single Grick coming out of the cave, it's terrorizing a local caravan, you go fight the Grick, you fight some additional enemies on the way, you fight some enemies that, some fodder, some minions in the cave that it's supposedly coming out of. You maybe find evidence of more Gricks in there, but by this point, you've leveled up once or twice, and maybe you found a magic weapon, maybe somebody in a caravan that was being attacked decides to reward you with a magic weapon. The person who gave you the contract to begin with hands you a magic weapon as well, gives you a nice flame-tongued sword. So now 3 out of maybe 4 martial weapon users in the party have access to weapons that, get around this issue. And all of a sudden, everything's working as intended. All of a sudden, the party can take on 3 or 4 of these bad guys at once, whereas beforehand, 1 was a significant challenge. This is not a bad thing. This is how the game is supposed to work. You say, it's a challenge until it's not. Yes, correct. A small party of goblins is a challenge for first level party until it is not when they reach 3rd level. That is the intended progression of the game. This is not an own in any way. It's specifically quite fun. It's one of the better aspects of D&D because so maybe not 5th edition in particular, but broadly speaking, tabletop RPGs handle this far better than video games do. Video games usually have to engage in a lot more balance work and shenanigans, especially in an open world style game, than tabletop RPGs do. And this is one of the few areas in which video games, I would say, fail. Or not fail, they don't succeed as well as tabletop RPGs do in this regard. So before we move on, does anybody have any questions? Does all this make sense? My justification so far is this is a feature, not a bug. This mechanic is intended to keep a lot of lower level enemies with this kind of resistance I would say exceedingly deadly in comparison to how they're going to be treated in just a couple of levels, and that's done so that you can introduce these monsters as a mini-boss first, the players level up off of them, and then they're equipped to handle a wider threat involving these creatures. Let's see here. John CM said, how big are Gricks? I believe they're medium. They're size medium. So they're small enough, interestingly enough, to be grappled by the PC. So even somebody who doesn't have a magic weapon at this point is still in a pretty good position to negatively affect these creatures. Darian says he follows. I assume everybody else is following. There's no great cry of protest in the chat, so we'll keep going.
Like we've seen changes since the Monster Manual. Literally hundreds of creatures in D&D have resistance to bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage, and in the vast majority of those cases, once you have a +1 longbow, it's just words on the page.
Yes. So this follows my earlier argument that this was more or less the seemingly random placement of creatures with resistance or immunity to non-magical weapon damage. Again, non-magical physical damage, we could say. Specifically, it's only bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage. It's very annoying I have to specify that, but the game is the game. What can be done is that this was an incomplete directive. It was not at random. It's just that they didn't finish the book. They didn't finish any of the books. And this is one of the ways in which they didn't finish the initial Monster Manual.
Also, in every case where some special material might be required to damage a foe because of thematic reasons for that resistance or immunity, like a silver weapon against a werewolf, or an adamantine weapon against an iron golem, a +1 weapon will do the job just as well. Better, actually, because it's +1. For a DM, this is a hard every case where some special material...
We're going to go back to that just a second,
and in the vast
a little bit
majority
slower.
of those cases, once you have a +1 longbow, it's just words on the page. Also, in every case where some special material might be required to damage a foe because of thematic reasons for that resistance or immunity, like a silver weapon against a werewolf or an adamantine weapon against an iron golem, a +1 weapon will do the job just as well. Better, actually, because it's +1.
Okay, so this is another argument that I actually tend to agree with a little bit more. Let's hear. John CM says magic weapons are indeed better. Yes, they are. I do like the character fantasy, and I don't know specifically why this appeals to people. I have not done a great investigation into it, but I've talked about this like with my first DM mat and my first gaming group. Even recently, coming to think of how I think it actually came up because we were playing Valheim and we had silver swords that we could use against undead enemies that were supposedly more effective by them. And the age-old conversation came up. It would be so much nicer if these weapons, if silvered weapons and adamantine weapons, because I think those are pretty much the only two special weapons in 5th edition as a default, the ones that are mentioned in the player's handbook and DM's guide respectively, that are intended to bypass these resistances and immunities, but they don't do anything else, right? You don't get extra damage from silvering your weapons, which is an expensive process. You don't get extra dice. You don't get a hit bonus. There's no warding effect against them. The adamantine weapons, ditto for that. Whether they don't do anything extra to the particular constructs that are normally that provide this exception. It's not clear exactly what their purpose is, because you could provide them with, actually, I'm going to save this argument specifically for later. But what I will say is I'll sympathize with the idea that you might want to include these weapons in the game and have them maintain relevance past the introduction of a magic weapon. That's totally fine. That's totally reasonable. It would be nice if they did something special, because the idea behind these creatures like werewolves is that a silver weapon is special in a way that a magic weapon specifically might not be. They would like a lot of people would like this status quo reversed, where the magic weapon doesn't do anything special to the creature who is immune to a specific weapon condition, or weapon conditions outside one in particular, like silver, right? The magic weapon doesn't do anything special to them. It just lets you bypass the resistance, or I think in the case of werewolves, immunity. But the silver weapon would actually do something special to them. That's a fine idea. I can definitely sympathize with that. And it'll come back later, because the issue as to why it doesn't work that way in 5th edition right now, or why it can't work that way in 5th edition, is just about to come up.
For a DM, this is a hard mechanic to manage. If you don't give the weapon-using players a magic weapon, then you place them at a disadvantage against a high percentage of creatures in the game, and it's a disadvantage that the party warlock firing Eldritch Blast doesn't face.
Okay, so we're going to stop here again. I know that we haven't made a lot of progress through the video as of yet. That's because a very large section in the middle here is pretty much going to get cut out and summarized right about this section. So don't worry we're actually quite close to the end of this whole shenanigan. But so, Treantmonk, we're going to go back 10 seconds or so.
Creatures in the game, because it's +1. For a DM, this is a hard mechanic to manage. If you don't give the weapon-using players a magic weapon, then you place them at a disadvantage against a high percentage of creatures in the game, and it's a disadvantage that the party warlock firing Eldritch Blast doesn't face.
Okay, so do you guys understand his argument there? Does everything make sense with what he just said? If you don't give magic weapons out, then the party is not going to be able to, not the party, specifically your martial weapon users are not going to be able to deal with this. Six of Swords says, yeah, why is that a problem though? That's my thoughts exactly. Why is that a problem? It's a problem in 5th edition because you're told that magic items are rare. You're not supposed to give them out often. You're only supposed to get supposedly at the beginning of the game, they wanted you to have a +1 sword at 5th level or something like that, and this is unimaginably stupid. This was thanks to the influence of an OSR YouTuber named Casimir Urbanski, is his pen name, He titles himself the RPG pundit, the tutorial boss of internet shitlords, I believe is his tagline. Who was consulted on D&D along with Zach Smith, a few other OSR YouTubers or creators. I don't think they were YouTuber back then, but other OSR creators who insisted that what made magic items special was that they were rare. Not the experience of having a magic item, not the common experience, as opposed to the rare experience, of not having any magic at all, and it's sort of being the point that RPGs trade in experiences, so you might want to prioritize the things that increase your experience, that make it more unique, that make the experience a little bit more enjoyable. None of that came in. It's just, well, if there's a whole bunch of +1 swords out there, then your player isn't going to like the experience of getting a +1 sword. There has to be only one +1 sword in the entire campaign, and that'll make it really cool when you get one. Obvious nonsense, cargo cult design thinking from stupid people that don't know how to design games, because it's mostly a lost art in this industry. So why is it a problem if the DM has to give out magic weapons to overcome this? Because a lot of DMs do not want to give out magic weapons, or at the very least, if we're being as charitable as we could possibly imagine, as charitable as we possibly can, a lot of them are not thinking to give out magic weapons. They're not thinking that the campaign has structure or that there are loot tables in need of deploying somewhere on the campaign map, somewhere in the path of the parties. If you're railroading or doing points of light or anything, or if you're following any kind of set path or narrative, or rough path or narrative, you still need to put these things in front of the party, and that's another mechanic in which the DM sort of has to keep their foot on the gas in order for the game to work properly. And a lot of them are either don't want to do this or not aware of this fact. And in either case, the players are going to have a more... Sorry to burp. The players are going to have a dissatisfying experience localized in a specific section of the party, which is the martial weapon users. They're specifically going to have a more dissatisfying experience. Because their DM more or less forgot to give out magic weapons. Or they stupidly followed the advice of the DMG and thought, yes, not getting loot makes getting loot fun. Nobody likes getting loot. They only like not having loot for a really long time, and then finally, maybe at the end of a campaign, getting loot. Yeah, that's the most fun experience all of us can imagine in tabletop RPGs. Say, why do you think that video games are a $100 billion industry, and tabletop RPGs are, what, like a $50 million industry? I can't even remember. No, it's more than that, but I don't think it's even above $1 billion at this point. It's something infinitesimally small in comparison.
On the other hand, if you provide magic weapons, then all this mechanic really does is ensure that the creature whose challenge rating is affected by this now meaningless resistance is not the challenge for the party it was supposed to be.
Correct! This is again, Treantmonk, this is again the game functioning as intended. This challenge rating here, really 27 hit points. It's challenge rating 2 for 450 XP. This is intentional. This is how the game is supposed to work. This is more like a challenge rating 3 or a challenge rating 4 creature to a party of level 1 or level 2 adventurers who haven't gotten their first magic item yet. So you introduce this creature, they're a mini-boss or a boss of sorts that the players have to fight past, and in the process of doing so, they're provided with loot, they're provided with advancement, because why are we playing this game if not to advance our characters? Why are we doing this instead of video games? Of course we're going to advance our characters, and that advancement is supposed to turn this creature, which was threatening, into something that can be deployed en masse to make it threatening. And that, because that is fun. This one thing, which was a big threat to you, is now no longer as much of a threat, but now there's a hell of a lot more of them, so now we have to go wade into these creatures to wipe them out, and it feels even more satisfying. It's ridiculous. Muktuk says, "Oh, hi, you must be new to the channel here. I haven't seen you here before." But hello. It's been a while. Do 5e monsters not even have treasure types? I don't believe so. No, I don't think they do. So if I were to, let's see here, how do I hide my where's that again? Okay, here's what I'm gonna do. I'm just going to hide this down here. Or rather up here. I'm gonna hide the URL. Make sure everything is kosher. But one of the things that we did, so I believe the answer specifically is just no. No, there are not treasure types. One of the things that we did when we were designing Shilmus Valley, let's just go to, when were we here first? When we were designing the encounter manual, is we started discussing and creating categories of loot and other things that were supposed to in some way impact your enjoyment. Let me make sure that this is still not good. Good. If I scroll down, they don't have treasure types. We included components, stuff like, okay, here's a Delegate Hide. A roll from 1 to 15 has a maximum value of 100 gold pieces. Delegate Mine Shard, maximum value of 400 gold pieces on a roll of 16 to 20. I scroll down further. We included stuff like treasure types, and you're not going to see, the point of me bringing this up is that even if in the Displacer Beast bestiary entry in the monster 5th edition monster manual, you're not going to see anything like this, even though the entry, the description might mention something like, by the way, the cloaks of a Displacer Beast are useful as the prime ingredients for a cloak of displacement. You will not see it actually mentioned you will not see any kind of pricing mentioned in the 5th edition monster manual. Not see anything of that sort. So, sucks, but... So the short answer is no. There's nothing of that sort. I'm going to go back down there, and that's fine. Yes. Yes. Continue watching the video.
The dilemma is far worse. There's a certain level where if your weapon-using character doesn't have access to a magical weapon, you should actually expect to face resistance to non-magical bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage in most combats, and immunity to that damage.
No, I think I cut him off. Let's keep watching for another few seconds.
Damage in others. When the use of your weapon is your specialty, weapon-using character doesn't have access to a magical weapon, you should actually expect to face resistance to non-magical bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage in most combats, and immunity to that damage in others. When the use of your weapon is your specialty, it leaves you neutered in most combats. However, there are things that can be done in your build to make sure you have magic.
Okay, so just going to pause here. This is the point at which you need to either talk to your DM or walk away from the table, because for some reason, if you don't have, in a game like 5th edition, if you've been adventuring for God knows how many months to get you up to something like 6th level, and you still don't have something like a magic weapon with you, the DM is at this point sort of doing it intentionally. I don't think that you have the excuse of ignorance for, I don't know, past your first or second campaign to say, I didn't know that I was supposed to give you guys loot and stuff like that. I didn't know that would be fun. At the point at which you actually have a single campaign under your belt, you've already probably recognized at least a hefty portion of the advice that the DMG gives you is bad, and you shouldn't be following it. And at that point, it should hit you. You are responsible because you put yourself in a position of authority over your friend group or people who you are acting in a friendly fashion with, who you have more or less promised some entertainment for their fine evenings across the course of many months, that you should be giving them loot. So on the player side here, this is where you start checking out the campaign. You start looking for a different campaign. You start looking to take a break for a little while, because he's correct. This is not fun, but this is not the fault of the mechanic that we're criticizing today. This is the fault of the Dungeon Master Guide's advice. This is the fault of the game's other mechanics surrounding magic weapons, which do not allow them to fall into your lap. They have to be placed, more or less. And this is sort of also not on the Dungeon Master specifically. This is not on your referee specifically. Except it kind of is. The responsibility was foisted upon them, but you should want to provide players with magic weapons anyways. You should want to provide them with loot. You should want to provide them with items or rewards or loot that increases their agency in the campaign, because otherwise there's no point to playing this over a video game, except specifically to have a worse experience. And that's probably a defensible position for a lot of people in the tabletop industry. I think it accurately describes a lot of their motivations for why they play the way they do. Yes, Muktunky said the B word, build. Actually, I love builds. I love build culture. I love making shit. I shouldn't have cursed. It's a live stream. This is a short live stream anyways. Oh well. But yes, no, we are pro power gamer here.
Magical attacks. You can make sure to access the magic weapon spell, or take 3 levels in Warlock and select Pact of the Blade, or get 6 levels
We're going to skip this discussion of character features.
at best, and an outright departure from your character concept at worst. And it's either a complete necessity or completely worthless, depending on whether you get a magical weapon or not. Something the DM has complete control over. As a DM, it's tempting to say that no creature.
Yes, okay, so this is one thing that he brings up that is probably a good thing, is that these character features are placed in the game sort of pointlessly. If your DM does not want you to have access, there's a few exceptions to this. Something like unarmed strikes there's typically not weapons for your unarmed strikes, especially in the base game. There's typically not weapons or magic items to turn your beast companion from your beast companion's attacks from magical to or non-magical to magical, or your wild shape form from non-magical to magical. So in those cases, which there isn't like a clear template for sword that you're supposed to use, it does make sense a little bit for the game to place those features to fix that problem in as class features. I would prefer that they did it as magic items instead, but that wasn't going to work in 5th edition for the reasons we've already discussed. So that is fair to the point where, well, if your DM doesn't want you to have functional attacks or functional attack pattern, or be able to negatively affect these creatures in the way that really you should be at that level, there's not much of a point to putting it in the game. You could have put other features in there. You could have put other cooler stuff in those classes. So let's see here. Give them all the magic items and let them figure it out. Yep, that's my Thunderchild said that in the chat. That is his strategy. I have played with him. That is his strategy for running a campaign. And it's a lot of fun. It's distinctly more fun than games that don't have that kind of style to them. So, let's continue on with his particular criticism.
Creature has resistance to non-magical attacks unless it's really thematically appropriate. And maybe just buff the hit points of the creatures you remove the mechanic from. But that has consequences as well. Spells like animate objects are
Okay, we're going to pause here again because we're going to skip this entire section because Treantmonk makes a very specific, I think, cogent point. But he runs through a ton of examples and all the foundation first, which is probably, I think I said this on a live stream recently. I sort of hate when people do this. I just want them to lay out the thesis first so that I have some kind of context for this 6 minutes of supporting details that I don't have any metric or I don't have any existing structure to tie in these 6 minutes of details into a coherent point myself, and I'm probably not paying attention to them all that much as a result. It kind of just seems like you're spamming numbers out at me. So he's going to discuss animate objects. He's going to discuss the summoning spell of, Conjure conjure beasts, conjure animals, conjure animals. And he's going to use the example of the barbarians' typical attack pattern with and without a magic weapon and what kind of damage they typically do. And the reason he brings out these three separate examples is to describe that animate objects and even, I'll put the caveat later, spells like animate objects and spells like conjure animals, things which conjure damaging effects, high damaging effects, or high pools of damage that would normally get... Nope, I shouldn't phrase it that way either. There are a number of spells in D&D which conjure damaging effects that far outstrip their typical power at these given levels, except for the fact that they do not bypass the damage resistance or damage immunity that presumably a barbarian at equivalent levels is going to be able to produce. At the point at which somebody is casting conjure animals, certainly casting animate objects, they should have a magic weapon at that point, and this allows them to have a gameplay advantage against an enemy with resistance or especially immunity to bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage from non-magical weapons that something like a wizard or something like a druid do not. They have to use other spells in order to get around it, and those spells might have disadvantages. So that's the entire point of this segment, and that's his justification for why you can't just get rid of the non-magical, of resistance or immunity to non-magical bludgeoning, piercing, or slashing damage, because all of a sudden, one of the few martial advantages in 5th edition goes by the wayside, and animate objects is always preferable to having a fighter with a magic sword, or supposedly, conjure animals is always preferable to having or using a fighter or barbarian with a magic sword. He screwed up the math here a little bit in a way that a lot of people usually do. In fact, let me just give you the example.
Attack and pack tactics. Yet. And these objects are tough. 20 hit points each and a solid 18 armor class. You can bet they're way harder to hit than that reckless attacking barbarian. And animate objects isn't even an outlier or even the worst example. How about conjure animals? With that same 5th level spell slot, the druid can summon 16 velociraptors, each one with multi-attack and pack tactics. Now with a +4 to hit, they only hit on a 14 or higher on a d20, or 35% of the time, but pack tactics is going to give them all advantage, so they'll actually hit 58% of the time. The bite does a d6 + 2, that averages 5.5 damage on a hit, so 55% times 5.5 is 3.03. And then our critical damage, it's 10% because of advantage, times 3.5 is 0.35. So each bite from a velociraptor is doing about 3.38 damage on average. Then the claw, that's a d4 + 2, that averages 4.5 damage on a hit, 55% chance to hit, times 4.5, that's 2.48 damage. Then our critical damage for that, 10% chance.
Okay, we're gonna pause here, because it's just a lot of math following, and he screws a little bit of it up. And this is a common mistake of people who are not game designers, who nevertheless find themselves critics or providing critiques of design. When it comes to something like a velociraptor, there is a little ignored detail here, which is that they only have 10 hit points. So yes, a lot of them can do a lot of damage doing blah 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 blah. However, they only have 10 hit points. So it becomes trivially easy to wipe lots of them out, especially in any encounter in which there are a large set of spare attacks that might actually be usually wasted on something like a fighter with an 18 armor class, because the goblin is usually not going to hit a fighter with an 18 armor class. But a velociraptor with a 13 armor class, 2 goblins per velociraptor, just shooting, or maybe even 2 goblins per velociraptor, 2 kobolds per velociraptor, can easily wipe out 10 hit points. And then all of a sudden you don't have something like this out. I think this is probably nitpicking against the broader point. I think that even if this specific example has been diminished in some capacity. I think his broader point that taking out resistance or immunity to non-magical bludgeoning, piercing, wet, or slashing damage removes the specific martial advantage that people get to take advantage of. Would be bad for the game, would be unhealthy for the game, would unfairly launch magic users into an even more superior position. I think that's still a defensible position. I think he's probably right about it. It's just kind of a... I had to nitpick. Because this is just... I hate when people do this. I hate when people leave out critical details like this, because I think it does detract from the larger point. I think that when I upload this as a video, I think if I hadn't mentioned this right here, somebody else who was familiar with maybe a modicum of game design would have pointed this out, and then they would have used that to attack his larger point. So I'm pointing out this is a small fault in the example that I don't think detracts from the larger point. That's more or less my point of stopping on this. So let's go over to some of his house rules.
I'll tell you what I do, and my top-level Patreon subscribers know this because I use this house rule in the D&D games I DM for them. I treat all bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing attacks from player characters as magical, period. So if your barbarian attacks with a greatsword, it's considered magical. But if your tiny velociraptors summoned with conjure animals attack, those attacks aren't considered magical. Now this kinda sorta works, but it's far from perfect. I mean, here's one problem, and it's not the only one. So you're playing an arcane archer, and you get to level 7.
We're going to pause here because I actually have a better example for why this is an issue based on something that he got wrong earlier. Remember, he doesn't specify a level range. If he does give this to players at a specific level, like 5 or 6 or 7, this gotcha is more or less moot, and I'm okay with that. But if all damage from player characters is magical, then creatures like this are no longer a mini-boss for first or second level characters, or not as much of a mini-boss or boss for first or second level characters. And you don't get the transition of a new dangerous enemy being introduced to the party as a hook, more or less. I didn't want to say plot hook, quest hook for the party in the form of a dangerous enemy that they then overcome, and as a result of the experience and the combination of experience and loot that they get, turning this enemy into something that's not nearly as threatening on its own, but suddenly becomes the plot happens, quest happens, and all of a sudden a lot of them are coming in at once, necessitating that they are now dangerous in groups as opposed to alone. With his house rule, you don't get that transition. I think it diminishes sort of the gameplay loop of the game. I think it diminishes the gameplay loop of D&D and makes it a little bit less satisfying. But I want to point out that this is from the issue I took earlier with his example of the Grick, I think this is a through line throughout the entirety of his critique. Or at the very least, up to this point, we're at 11 out of 22.
So now your longbow attacks are treated as magical. No other benefit. No +1 to hit or damage, just the ability to ignore the resistance or immunity to non-magical piercing damage. Well, with my house rule, this feature is totally useless, because they're already treated as magical. It's now a pointless feature. It's not a good thing. And it's one of those things where I haven't really figured out what kind of house rule I should do to make up for that. But
yep, so this is an issue that we discussed earlier, where these class features were already kind of useless. You should all, at 7th, I cannot imagine. I've sadly been in campaigns where this was the case, but I cannot imagine getting to 7th level and just not having a magic weapon. That's stupid. It's stupid. Why would you have to use... There are small cases in which this would still be useful. Like, you didn't, for whatever reason, your favorite magical bow was lost, your backup favorite magical bow was lost, and your tertiary favorite magical bow, the +1 that you got at 2nd level that you've just been keeping in your backpack, was also lost, so you just had to pick up a crossbow or a longbow off the ground to use with your arcane magic, and you wanted... Like, that's fine as... It's not a class feature. It's not worthy of being a class feature by any stretch of the imagination. It's maybe worth being a backup feat, a background benefit, I would say. Yeah, I don't think it even comes up as I don't think it's even justifiable as a feat. I think you might be able to justify a feature like this in a proper, coherent, real game as a background feature. But it's a class feature here because one of the issues that we discussed earlier was for WotC, something like this pulls double duty, is not only hedging against the fact that they know the referees are broadly speaking bad, partially because they're just bad to begin with, and partially because they also, on top of that, give the referees bad advice. But also, WotC is terrible at developing new class features. They are, I think Mike Merles was probably the only person on that team who was, as far as class design is considered, not creatively bankrupt. But he's no longer on that design team, so what can be done?
You know what? It's not just because of my house rule. If you don't play with my house rule and you get a magic longbow, this is still a useless feature. It just feels bad to get a feature that turns out not to be a feature at all. I mean, here's the nightmare scenario.
Alright, he said what I just said.
Imagine this. You play a longbow fighter. You fight through the levels. You're facing resistances to non-magical attacks, and then you select the Arcane Archer subclass. Still facing regular resistances to your attacks, but at least you know, level 7 is on the horizon. Eventually I'll be able to deal with it. Then you're level 6, you're just about there, and you find a Moon Touch longbow. Oh, crap. I mean, the DM thinks they did something nice for you. They've been watching you struggle in combat after combat, and then they decided it was time to allow you to participate fully. Maybe they didn't know about Magic Arrow coming up next level. But boy, it sucks. Now, I noticed something in the most recent.
So I'm going to pause here. Earlier we discussed the subject of adamantine and silver weapons specifically as stopgaps in the game between between not having access to a magic weapon, but still being allowed to fully participate and fully overcome fully bypass the resistances and immunities of specific creatures that have been keyed in. So in my very first campaign, I misread the rules for silvering your weapons, and I silvered, I think, both of my short swords. Because I was playing a ranger with 2 short swords. Caleb is going to remember this. And Caleb is going to remember the impact that this had on the campaign. We talked about it with our DM, Matt, later. Because we went into an area. I misread, right? So I misread the rules. I thought it was going to give me some special benefit against undead, probably because I had been playing a lot of The Witcher recently. So I went and I got both of my short swords silvered for about 100 gold pieces each, and I thought it was awesome. They ended up not having an impact for a very long time. But, we later sailed across the sea to go fight what ended up being a town of werewolves. And Matt was apparently behind the scenes. He told us about this later, thinking, "Oh God, what am I going to do for each of these characters? What am I gonna? I don't know what to do because they each have. Not all of them have magic weapons yet, so now I need to pack the game with magic weapons. Who has magic weapons at the moment, or so far?" And he saw me, and I had inadvertently screwed myself by giving myself silvered short swords with which I would be able to fight these werewolves. And in the moment, I actually didn't experience what this person is, the hypothetical complaint here. I actually did think it was cool that I had prepared in advance and now I had access to these. I was able to bypass the immunity because I had silvered my short swords at something like level 2 of that campaign, and we were just coming up on, I think, level 5 or level 6. I think it was level 5. I think we were level 6 by the time we got out of that area. And interestingly enough, for this random edge case example, even having one magical weapon would not have completely removed the utility of having a silvered short sword because I was a 2-weapon fighter. I was using 2-weapon fighting. Right? Give me a moment, folks. Alrighty. Somebody just left a desk at my door. Can you believe that? Who would do such a thing? But yeah, so I thought it was actually cool. We had this niche edge case in which being a two-weapon fighter, having a silvered weapon was still handy for me, even if I had gotten another magical weapon at a more appropriate level. We didn't know what we were doing. It was our first campaign. It wasn't Matt's fault at all. It still would have worked out nicely for me. But the issue is in a lot of cases, having multiple weapons to be able to use in a given situation isn't all that beneficial. The adamantine and silvered weapons only allow you to bypass immunity or resistance in their respective use cases. They don't do anything extra, so what you often find them doing, you often find these places, I did have another campaign in which this was the case, you often find these weapons being used as a stopgap measure to prolong, instead of providing these as like literally level 1 loot, which I think is probably their appropriate place in the game. Instead of providing them as literal level 1 loot, you don't get them. They're used to prolong when you actually get a magic weapon. And I think that's probably bad. So I think their use case in the game right now is basically to extend the period at which you actually get a magic weapon, from when you start the campaign to when you actually get a magic weapon. I think they're used to actually prolong that period and make the game worse. I think it's a little annoying. This next section here, I don't think is going to be. Yeah, so talking about whether or not it's being removed from 1D&D, we're gonna jump through this here.
1D&D playtest packet that I talked briefly about in a previous video. In fact, there were two things I noticed, and I talked about it in multiple videos. The Devotion subclass for Paladin has a Channel Divinity feature they get at 3rd level called Sacred Weapon. In 5th edition, one of the benefits of this feature is that your weapon becomes magical for the duration. That was removed in the most recent playtest. Or, to be more accurate, it was changed. Now, instead of the weapon becoming magical, you can change your damage type to radiant damage if you want to. So you choose, when you make the attack, whether you do your regular damage type or you do radiant. The Circle of the Moon subclass for Druid has a wild shape feature they get at 6th level called Primal Strike in 5th edition. And the benefit of this feature is that your attacks in beast form count as magical. This feature was removed in the most recent playtest. Or to be more accurate, it was changed. Now instead of your attacks being treated as magical, you can change your damage type to acid, cold, fire, lightning, or thunder damage if you want to. You choose when you make the attack whether you do your regular damage type or the elemental damage type. So in my videos discussing these changes, I speculated. I said that maybe the D&D design team was planning to get rid of resistances to non-magical damage. And I also said, if that was the case, then great. And I was asked in the comments, as well as in other channels, why.
Yeah, so I think that this is probably a good change. It's one of the few things that I actually don't know if this is a good change. I think it is at the very least an interesting change from the perspective that damage types in 5th edition sometimes do have more use cases, or sometimes produce more effects than what you can expect from something like silver or adamantine, or just bypassing or overcoming resistances. Sometimes dealing fire damage actually does something extra. Dealing damage with the silvered weapon never deals anything extra, but sometimes creatures have a vulnerability to fire damage. Sometimes they are they have some condition that is impacted by fire damage. Sometimes you could use fire damage to improvise better, more naturally in the context of the game. If somebody throws oil down, you could use fire damage to ignite it. So if you have access to fire damage and you have access to a feature that gives you the choice of either normal damage or fire damage, and you get to choose which damage type you're using, I think that's pretty cool. I think it's good. I think Treantmonk thinks it solves a problem here that doesn't actually exist. I think it just adds something extra to the game that's a little bit more interesting, and is a little bit more fun. In fact, no, so there is one problem that he mentioned that we were in agreement actually did exist. Features which just let you overcome damage for the purpose of overcoming damage, not really having an impact if it's a class or if it's a feature that a magic item can just overcome. So that is a problem. That is an issue that we're sort of in agreement on.
I thought it was great. Well, I've already gone over why I think these resistances are bad to the game, but I also mentioned problems with just getting rid of them. And if they just reprint monsters with the exact same stat blocks, but they remove the resistance, or they expand it to cover magical bludgeoning, piercing, or slashing damage as well, then they fix one problem, but they create new problems. Fixing the issue with resistance to non-magical bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage requires more than just abandoning the mechanic. However, that is the first step. Step 1, get rid of the mechanic.
No, it isn't, because we've already explained that this guy is wrong. It's not going to. There's a very specific gameplay loop that is intentional in D&D, that is desirable, that is fun, that is the virtue, one of the conceits of playing a tabletop RPG as opposed to playing a video game. Is it's a lot easier to design this gameplay loop where a creature that is a mini boss at level 1 suddenly becomes a minion at just like 2 or 3 levels later. This is preferable. This is something that we want. We do not want to get rid of it.
If you want some kind of special monster, the dreaded Gilzarap. Step 2 is monster redesign. Once you get rid of the mechanic, or at least largely abandon it, then it's a matter of going through the plethora of creatures that used to have it. Should it not have the resistance in the first place? I mean, our Grick example has no reason to have the resistance, so maybe you just remove it. But
Yes, it does. As we explained earlier, it's a creature of the Underdark. The Underdark is one of the few zones in D&D which are supposed to be more threatening, more deadly, and you are supposed to encourage players to not go down there until they are prepared to do so. So it makes sense for its natural denizens to be more deadly because the area is supposed to be more deadly. It's supposed to have more deadly challenges. What are challenges in 5th edition? They are combat.
if you remove it, then you really need to up the hit points of the creature. 27 hit points isn't very much for a CR2 creature without damage resistance. I mean, the next alphabetical.
Yes, and again, that's the point. Is that 27 hit points is not a lot of hit points for a creature without damage resistance. That's why you're supposed to be able to struggle with it at 1st and 2nd level, and when it comes to 4th level, you're supposed to go back and be able to wade through them the second you have a magic weapon, and the second you have a little bit better damage and a hit bonus. You're supposed to be able to slaughter them at will. That's the entire point of design like this. When he says redesigning monsters, he means adjust them to be proper bags of hit points, regardless of context or level, that always have more or less the same presence on the battlefield. But something like 27 hit points is actually important because it determines whether or not you can kill these things in 1 or 2 hits at later levels. If you increase it to something like 59 hit points, congratulations, it's a mini-boss at 1st or 2nd or 3rd level, but it is still a major combatant at all later levels because 60 hit points is a lot of hit points. You can't burn through that easily, except at like very higher levels, or with critical hits or something like that. So no longer can this creature simultaneously be low-level mini-boss and upper-level minion. It has to be low-level mini-boss, or here it's just low-level boss, period. It's low-level boss. There's no way of getting around it. And then it is mini-boss throughout the entire remaining tiers of what most people are going to play at. So this is a redesign in the technical sense. It is undesigned in that Treantmonk is not actually considering the impact or the consequences of changing the monster in this way, because I guess he's just not a designer. I don't know anything about this guy's design credentials or history. I just know that he does a lot of guides for players and for GMs, but this is not I will be kind. This is something I would expect a first-time freelancer to slip up on. And so I sympathize with the idea that he would miss the point of a creature like this having this kind of resistance or immunity. But updating the hit points in this way is not going to produce. You have to think, when you're changing these numbers, they don't all change in the same way. You have to think about it. You have to really, really think about it. Okay, 27 hit points. Well, a low-level guy is going to struggle with that, especially if it has resistance. But a higher-level guy is not going to worry about the resistance, and they can burn through 27 hit points easily, so it makes it a lot easier. That's going to make the combat go by faster. 60 hit points? Come on.
CR2 entry in the monster manual is the Griffin. That has 59 hit points, and that hit point range isn't unusual at all for CR2. Then you probably need to consider that for some creatures, resistance to one or more of those damage types actually makes sense. Like, a fire elemental is literally made of fire. It's not really solid at all. So maybe it should have resistance to those damage types. And you definitely want some creatures that do have those resistances, because
That's the idea of magic weapons, is that they're magical, they're supposed to bypass what would otherwise be a normal... The fantasy of picking up a magic sword is that it lets you hurt things that can't normally be hurt by anything. If you take away the resistance period, or if you take away the resistance bypassing nature, or immunity bypassing nature of magic weapons, then you're diminishing the point of acquiring them to begin with.
then it will provide features like Sacred Weapon or Elemental Wild Shape a benefit to changing damage types.
I'm sorry, I gotta stop on that again. Like, the entire myth is filled with these things that you can't hurt this creature. You can't hurt this guy. You can't hurt Vecna unless you have XYZ. You can't harm this other mythical creature. It requires a magic sword because our normal steel is useless against it. It's like, oh, well, if normal steel is useless against it, then just make sure all steel is useless against it. Make sure that all damage is used. No. Make sure all physical damage is just useless against it. No, that's the point of magic swords.
When it's needed. Also, bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing resistance and immunity are probably lumped together more than they need to be. Like, if you were to give a Bone Nega resistance to piercing damage, but not bludgeoning or slashing, I think that would make sense. Bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing are treated basically the same, way more often than they probably should be. I mean, imagine this creature was resistant to piercing, but vulnerable to bludgeoning.
Alright, this is... I get the bludgeoning thing. It's probably a word count issue, but I also don't really care. We've already had 2 or 3 dumb examples. Hello to Bob Stevens in the chat, by the way.
Monster.
I never said hi to you.
But what about conjure animals and animate objects? Well, since Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, we've seen a change to how these kinds of spells operate. You're provided a single creature, which scales with higher spell levels, but you aren't ever getting 32 attacks.
Yeah, that's dumb. It's bad. It's no surprise that he's a fan of it.
These kind of spells would be just fine in this kind of game environment. In fact, they would be better. Here's Summon Construct. I avoid this spell. Why? Because it delivers non-magical bludgeoning damage. Why would I cast this when I could cast Summon Undead and deliver a far more reliable necrotic damage?
Why would you cast it, period? Why would you cast Summon Construct, period, when it's so much less fun than any of the many options that you're already provided in the player's handbook, like summoning a bunch of direwolves or summoning a bunch of velociraptors? Why would you willingly gimp yourself in that fashion unless you already had some weird fetish for worse performance? Which, again, is a fine explanation. We went through it earlier. It's a fine explanation for why a lot of the people in the tabletop RPG industry act the way they do, is that this is a dumb hobby for dumb people. And sometimes we like to improve our spirits by doing things worse.
But if necrotic damage, bludgeoning damage, and the various other kinds of damage didn't differentiate between magical and non-magical damage resistances, and the problem with these spells at the same time. A new player's handbook with fixed class features and spells, and a new monster manual with fixed resistances.
By fixed, he means gimped. Oh, this last one might be interesting.
A silver weapon should be an advantage when fighting a werewolf, but a silver weapon or a magic weapon, who cares? I think we could lose that. Though I would be careful with immunities. I mean, maybe in the case of the werewolf, the answer is just to give them a ton more hit points and to make them vulnerable to silver weapons. That could work. I think
No, God, dude. The math isn't the same. This is not a two-way street. This door only opens one way. I'm sorry. The math does not work. You can't just take away the thing that deals double damage and say, well, we'll just double the hit points, and it works the exact same way. No, it has an impact on how the game is played, because certain people are not going to be able to keep up with the damage production. Certain people are not going to... spells are capped in the amount of damage that they can do. It's not going to produce the same effect, but clear out a mechanic from other areas of the game that you want to ignore. You can't... I'm sorry. This is like, if a freelancer came to me with this, I would tell them, listen, I don't think you're fit for this project. I think you maybe need to get a few more design credits under your belt. I think you should probably go. It's a lack of understanding of something I like to call threshold focused design. Not all numbers in D&D, not all numbers in video games are interchangeable. Sometimes, if you the difference between a pistol. All right, let's take a video game example. The difference between a pistol that deals 24 damage and the difference between a pistol that deals 26 damage seems small. It's normally very small. You think it probably doesn't matter, right? Except that if players have 100 health, then the difference between hitting somebody with 4 shots, hitting somebody with 5 shots, because you have to overcome 100 hit points, is pretty big between 5 shots and 4 shots. I mean, that could be colossal. In a video game, that could be all the difference between whether or not you win or lose. It doesn't matter that you're only going to deal 26 damage. You only have to worry about 100. You're going to deal a total of 104. In 4 shots, you'll deal 104 damage. And with 5 shots of 24 damage, you'll deal 120 damage. Well, the 120 damage doesn't actually matter because the threshold that we're evaluating these numbers at, the threshold at which it changes the state of the game is 100. So it doesn't matter that one of these numbers looks way higher. If we give the 24 damage pistol 5 shots instead of 4, because the key is that the other pistol is going to kill them faster when it matters at the threshold of 100 hit points. So I'm probably going to do a full video on this in which I'm not just ad-libbing my explanation. But the idea of threshold-focused game design is that there are thresholds, there are points in the numbers that seem statistically insignificant, in which differences between competing game elements seem statistically insignificant, but produce wildly different outcomes that affect how people approach the game, how they are incentivized to respond to the game, and the outcomes of the game writ large, how much fun they're actually having. So that is my short primer for what will probably be a video later.
Vulnerability is a mechanic that is way underutilized in 5th edition. Think about playing D&D for a moment, and let's assume that you're playing and the monsters all have more hit points, but
Let's
Treants
not
are
think
vulnerable to
about
fire
this
and
right
slashing
now.
damage. Banshees are vulnerable to radiant damage. Beholders are vulnerable to piercing damage. I mean, stab it in the eye, right? Bone devils and nagas to bludgeoning damage. Fire giants to cold damage. Frost giants to fire damage. Maybe celestials shouldn't be resistant to necrotic damage. Maybe they should be vulnerable to it. Maybe diseased giant rats should be vulnerable to poison damage. I mean, you get the idea. Then the resistances, we would also have the
I will give him a little bit of a credit there. I think there's only, in the base player's handbook, I think there's only something like 30 vulnerabilities total out of something like 300 something monsters. Or maybe it's not 300 monsters. Maybe it's, I think the monster manual was like 300 pages, and there's a whole hell of a lot more than 300 monsters within. Even if we're discounting some of the smaller stat blocks that aren't going to come in play, like what is a cat? What is an octopus? What are its statistics? I think there's only about 30, and it would be a little bit more interesting to see, especially physical damage types, be acknowledged uniquely as vulnerabilities. Dragon Pulp confirms, relatively small amount of vulnerability in all 5e monsters. It's not something that really changed with either Volo's Guide to Monsters or Mordenkainen's Foam of Toes. Mordenkainen's Foam of Toes. Tome of Foes. I don't think, so it's a fine point. It comes off the back of a hell of a lot of not fine points.
automatically, creature to creature. The players could consider the description of the creature and then make reasonable estimations of what kind of resistances or vulnerabilities they might be facing. I mean, it is a player who's thinking, who decides, you know what, I'm going to try fire damage against the Frost Giant instead of doing necrotic damage, but 5th edition doesn't reward that kind of thinking nearly enough. Here is an...
Is this really thinking? Or is this just knowing that... It's not... God. God, he's so bad at justifying everything that he says. I'm sorry. This is not player thinking, because once you know that a troll has something like... Once you know that a troll is vulnerable to fire damage, or is not necessarily vulnerable to fire damage, once you know that its regeneration is stopped by something like fire damage, the question is not whether or not you can think of fire damage. The question should be, do you have a resource available to you that produces fire damage? It's not actually about thinking, because it's not something that... It's not an implicit combat condition. Remember when we discussed the Dragon Breath weapons a couple of weeks ago, we discussed the difference between explicit combat conditions and implicit combat conditions. Implicit combat conditions are things that are rewarded by players thinking about them. So if a dragon deals as much hit points, the example of that video was if your dragons deal damage equal to their current hit points, then the players are rewarded, in the way of taking less damage, for thinking of ways to deal damage to the dragon before it uses the breath weapon on them. But it's not an explicit condition of the game. Vulnerabilities and stuff like that are explicit conditions of the game. You either, 1, are aware of them, or you are not. And 2, you have a resource to take advantage of that, or you do not. It's not player thought. It's a resource game. And it would be interesting if the resource game of 5th edition was adjusted as to not be virtually infinite, but simultaneously low agency. You have an infinite number of, or near infinite number of resources at your disposal. As far as damage types are concerned, that's easy to pick up. Cantrips, even lower level spells, especially once you get past, 5th level, your access to different damage types is, you could pretty much cover the entire spectrum between your entire party. Or even between the entire spectrum between individual characters, no less. And if the resource game of 5th edition was adjusted such that players had to prioritize them a little bit more, either in terms of what items they purchased, what spells they chose, what character builds they had, that would be a little bit more interesting. But that's not the same as player thought.
Opportunity for the designers to change that. Now, I don't know if the D&D design team are planning any of these things. There has been no helpful grade designer's note insert in the playtest packets on the matter so far, and I haven't seen Jeremy Crawford address it in any of his discussions with Todd Kendrick.
You're not going to see Jeremy Crawford address anything except, did you find out about our new elves?
So this is all speculation on my part. But it's not speculation without some evidence, and it's not just the Devotion Paladin or the Moon Druid. Here's the Heavy Armor Master feat in 5th edition, and it's always been a pet peeve of mine that there is this restriction to non-magical attacks. Then in the Expert Classes playtest, we saw a feat redesign, and I noted and applauded the removal of the restriction. It was a no-brainer as far as I was concerned. But now, when I look back on it, it's just one more piece of evidence that the mechanic might be going away. And if they are doing that, and they do it right, then D&D could be a much better game for it. I'm crossing my fingers and crossing my toes. But we are seeing good signs. All will be
okay, that's
revealed eventually. But until then, I'm going to sit
like...
back, relax, and have some fun. D&D is for everyone. Thanks, everybody, and I'll talk to you soon.
Okay. Well, folks, that was the video we were reviewing. That went a little bit longer than the half hour I initially thought. Hey, Durian, PF1 with fixed reductions. I saw that comment while it was going on. I think you were referring to the point about threshold-focused game design and how it related specifically to, like, the math not working both ways. When it came to things like, the math not working both ways when it came to creatures like, what was it? Well, when it came to any of them, just swapping out resistances for vulnerabilities, and how that wasn't a one-to-one effect on the game, how it would actually just make the game worse. But I'm gonna go grab a drink of water. I'm gonna come back. If any of you guys have any questions, comments, whatever, pop them in now, and then we'll get ready to head out. I'll probably be around here for about the next 5-10 minutes. All right, I'm back. We just got a nice emergency weather warning. We still haven't. I still have not seen a tornado. This is not fair. I just want to see one like tear down 75. You don't need to drive that way anymore, right? Yeah. Yeah, me when the sky is green. Oh.
Like when the sky is like green, that's a tornado.
I saw green sky once. I think I sent you the video of like the little like cyclone that was forming next to the Tom Thumb.
Everybody says Dallas is going to get like a big at some point. Like we get tornadoes. Hill actually
Yeah.
big one. It touches down for 5 minutes.
Okay, so we're gonna look at the frost. All right, so we got 2 questions in chat. I'm gonna look up in anticipation for one, the frost salamander from 5th edition. Let's make sure that we got the actual correct one here. No, I don't think it's our flower pot, but I think it just.
Ours now.
I guess it's hardest now, but I don't know how it got over there. Okay, so Muktuk said, I think that you could do a lot more with damage types, but you'd end up with the equivalent of the old AC versus weapon type tables, which is pretty much the antithesis of 5e design with its fiddliness. Yep, there's room. I don't know if folks in the background can hear this. It's probably a little bit more audible when I'm actually speaking, but the sirens just started going off. The warning sirens. So it's interesting that you mentioned that. I love weapon versus AC tables. I've been playing in an AD&D campaign run by Jeffrey Johnson. Speaking of which, I have it's his book here, but it's an excerpt from an upcoming book. I think it makes for nice background audio that I'm going to be narrating, hopefully releasing an audiobook for. We have to go yell to editors, and I have to threaten them. But that's a small price to pay. And I'm really enjoying. I love this little excerpt from his upcoming book. It'll be delightful. Hopefully, I can do a review on stream that's upcoming. So to answer but also to finish up the answer for this point, because I know it sounds like I'm going off on a tangent, and you might be correct, but Seven Willows actually included weapon versus AC tables in this vein, except it wasn't for armor specifically, because you're usually fighting creatures that do not have armor, creatures which are usually not humanoids at all, do not wear armor. It's things like, so we replaced it with things like magic, magic versus armor versus scales. You know? And I think it was fun. I think I enjoyed it. Let's see here. Thoughts on features like that? I don't know why I pulled this up when you just gave me the thing. I guess in some capacity I did not trust it. How did I just do that? Alright, we're gonna zoom in here. How do I oh, that's not intentional. Search something, blah 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 blah. Oh, this is all screwed. But you added the feature in the chat, that's fine. Thoughts on features like this? The Frost Salamander's Burning Fury feature has vulnerability to fire, but if it takes fire damage, it instantly recharges its breath weapon, no roll required. I think this is fantastic. I remember building a dungeon with just a small dungeon that was supposed to be like inside the heart of a volcano. That had a Frost Salamander that was like in the process of being tamed, that couldn't be, that escaped in the process of like this volcano suddenly becoming active again because of the creatures inside, you know, the context for going out and clearing the dungeon. Oh, there's no this will be the last stream, folks, ever. I hope you say your goodbyes. Let's see here. Yeah, I think it's interesting. Yeah, you can put the cactus there, that's fine. Time to take the plants inside. I think it's cool. Yeah, so I think it is the only instance of it in 5th edition. I can't remember any others, but I really loved the mechanic. It seemed like a genuine rare note of creativity in what is otherwise a big bag of hit point game. It's the last stream, sorry. Throw in your likes before the stream ends. Give me one last hurrah here. Yeah, so it's a cool feature. I think it is interesting. I think it should make it in more often. I think it helps illustrate the F's in the chat. I think it helps illustrate the benefits, the virtues of 4th edition design, and how 5th edition is just obviously so much worse when you compare 4th edition features that actually made it into 5th edition. This is when the salamander takes fire damage, its freezing breath automatically recharges. This is, I think, pretty obviously a 4th edition feature, and it makes everything else in 5th edition just look like crap. Let's see here. I feel like it would be cool for things like the silver adamantium weapons. Maybe the werewolf gets a disadvantage on attack since it's scared of taking a damage from silver for lore reasons. That'd be fantastic! What a fantastic idea! What a great benefit! If I was designing, let's say I was designing a card game, and I am, if I wanted to include a little weapon-specific maneuver that was available to weapons that have been silvered, I would consider making that a card, or making that a tap feature, right? Something you can make use of. So it's good. Alright, throw your last questions in the chat. Here, we're going to get ready to end in a second, just to make sure I can, make sure I don't damage my voice. I should have been drinking water throughout this, but also to make sure that my new desk does not get rained on. I also hope that the power does not go out. That would suck. I'd be really upset with that, actually. App info for stop. Yes, it's fine. When's Seven Willows going to be available after the Kickstarter? I wanted to back it, but job hunting right now to get disposable money. Hey, no problem there, man. We got enough money to hire the artist that I wanted to hire, and put a little bit of art in there that I thought would be nice. And when is it going to be available? I would keep an eye out for it around April or March. Ooh, you know what? One of the things I'm considering doing is putting it up on Crowdfunder. So that'll be one option. But on Drive-Thru RPG, it'll probably be up there. I would say probably about May. Because I'm gonna put it up, within the next week. I'm gonna put it up on Crowdfunder for the folks. One, for the folks who missed it. Two, because different crowdfunding platform. Oh no! So the link was in the multi-classing video. It was in the comments. It was not in my, but it was not in the live chat. So I'm gonna make another invite here. And probably what I'm gonna do is just make a new. What I'm probably gonna do is just make like a description copy, something like, the streamer Destiny has all of his social links, and follow me here, check out this here, and then other relevant links are posted in the description along with it in a separate section. But if I just had that, I think it would be easier for folks to find me. So, edit invite link. We're going to set it to expire never. There we go. Say hi. Make sure that you let me know that you are a watcher of the channel, and I will give you the Beholder role, which is for folks who want to be notified about things just in case you don't see me on YouTube, or you want to be able to be included in discussions about recent YouTube videos. I think that this stream was actually fantastic. I think, Muck Texas, good chat, interesting stream. Don't get tornadoed. I will make no promises, but I will make a good faith attempt at the very least. And yeah, I think there's going to be plenty of bits from this stream that I can edit, chop up, and deploy as like a real video. That'll be an interesting experiment, but I think I'll have time for it this weekend. But I guess I'm going to be in my Discord. I'm going to be chatting about Seven Willows and stuff like it, because we got funded the other day. Thank you again to the YouTube chat. I going through my metrics, it looks like the vast majority of my funding came from YouTube, which I hugely appreciate. But yeah, all right. I think we're about ready to go. I gotta go collect my stuff. All right, folks. I will see you later. Thank you again.